Welcome everyone. This is the Taos Institute Dialogue with the Author. And we are here today with Bill Randall and Andy Achenbaum, author of the book Fairy Tale Wisdom. I'm very excited to be here. Thank you for joining us. And I will just say a few words about the Taos Institute. We're an educational institution, a nonprofit organization. We're entirely virtual. And we promote social constructionist, relational, and appreciative ideas, practices, and theory. We do so through many, many resources that you can find on our website, taosinstitute.net. And you can find books published by the Taos Institute Publications. Some of them are free for downloads. You can find videos and podcasts, recordings of events like these. We also recently started an online community, the Taos Institute online community. Hopefully you've seen our announcements. It's been quite an exciting new development for us. So if you're not a member yet of the Taos Institute online community, I invite you to join. It's free, it's open to all, everyone interested in those ideas, and it's really a space for everyone to contribute. So sharing ideas, resources, we will post our events there as well. And it's organized by topics, it's organized by groups. So hopefully it gives many options for all of you to join. It's also available on a mobile app, so that's a new development for us. So more opportunities to connect with each other and to share resources. And thank you again for coming. And I will let Bill and Andy introduce themselves, and we'll get right into a discussion about their new book.
Hi. I'm Bill Randall, and my colleague and co-author Andy Achenbaum is here today with us. Our other co-author and partner of Andy, unable to be here today, so it's just the two of us giving you our little sort of presentation on this book that the three of us wrote together over a period of years called Fairy Tale Wisdom, Stories for the Second Half of Life. So thank you, Alex, for coordinating this and giving us the opportunity to be with you today. At the bottom of that screen is a quotation from a colleague of mine here at St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada. And she had heard about the book. She said, it's what a fascinating way to approach the deep life reflection that seems to take up more and more of our thoughts as we age. Both Andy and I are gerontologists by trade, so we've written the book as gerontologists for people like ourselves in the so-called second half of life. Just before I turn things over to Andy to say a bit about himself, I wanted to just start with a quotation from one of our colleagues in the field of narrative psychology and narrative gerontology, which is kind of the area that I've been exploring, is Mark Freeman from College of the Holy Cross in Massachusetts. And he's written a wonderful book called Hindsight, Promise and Peril of Looking Backward. And one of the things he says, which I find quite a delicious way of capturing the nature of the stories that we are. He says, our lives are like richly ambiguous texts to be interpreted and understood, whose meanings are inexhaustible, whose mysterious existence ceaselessly calls forth the desire to know, and whose readings cannot ever yield a final closure. So that's kind of maybe sets the tone a little bit for the way that I, and I think Andy and Barbara, look at the nature of our lives. If our lives are thought of as stories, we speak about the story of my life. Well, these stories are incredibly complex, multi-layered, ever-changing entities. So maybe between Andy and me, we could give you a little bit of the story behind the book. We're going to talk for a little while, and then we really want to open things up for the second half of the hour for sure. So here you have three 70-plus-year-olds who have a common interest in aging, in spirituality, of broadly defined, and stories. Barbara, amazing individual, and her contribution to the book is, I hope you'll realize as you might read the book that it's quite stunning, and she really opens up a lot of doors. But she's a former psychoanalyst, if I have this correct, Andy. She was a a psychoanalyst for 25 years in New York City, and then switched around and went back to university and became an Episcopal priest. And that's how Andy and Barbara met. Andy, do you want to say a little bit about yourself and how the two of you met?
Since COVID, my frequent flyer miles have all exhausted. I haven't been to South Africa. I haven't been to Brazil. I haven't been to Germany for the last couple of years, thanks to them. But this is the first Zoom I think I've been on in Houston, where it was really an international gathering. And so I was sort of shocked to see where you all were chiming in from. My wife, actually, we pulled teeth to get her to come. She's in Houston, but she's at the dentist, and she decided that taking care of her mouth was more important than talking to you. So between Bill and I, we'll malign her.
And Andy, you're a retired gerontologist, if we could use the word retired in connection with you're a gerontologist, yes, Andy?
Yes. I'm 76 in a week and still pumping it out, but I have decided that life's short and I'd much rather spend my time pulling teeth with Barbara than publishing articles.
And also, Andy has had a strong interest over the years in the humanities aspects of aging, which is how he and I came to realize we had so much in common. As for myself, I was at one time a Protestant minister, and then saw the light, went back to university and reinvented myself as a gerontologist. And as I mentioned, some of us have been developing an interest in what we call narrative gerontology. So when the three of us, Barbara, Andy, and I, realized that we enjoyed each other's company so much that we ought to try to do something together, we said we ought to write a book together, Who doesn't want to sit around and write a book? A lot of fun, eh? Well, anyway, we wanted to write something that was not sort of formal, analytical, academic in style or tone, but somehow more playful and personal, and that would help us and hopefully our readers appreciate the complexities and the mysteries of later life on the inside. So we decided to, I don't know really how we came upon this particular topic, but we decided that, hey, wouldn't it be fun to revisit some of the fairy tales and fables and parables and other little stories that we recall being charmed by as children, and revisiting them now that we're not kids anymore? Not to analyze them as sort of arcane texts, but just to sort of play with what do those stories say to us now that we've got a few decades of life experience and the ups and downs of existence under our belts. So here's what we came up with. This is kind of the structure of the book. Part one is I think you folks maybe read the first chapter, The Inner Adventure of Later Life. But then in the second chapter, we decided that we, all three of us, would take a crack at the Tortoise and the Hare, Aesop's classic fable. And that was a fun exercise to realize that we each got very different things out of it, read very different things into it. We realized, though, that we couldn't do that for all of the other stories we wanted to look at. So we kind of divvied up the task. And Barbara took a number of stories that she wanted to look into. I took some that I wanted to look into. Andy did the same. And so we go back and forth in the middle of the book, from the Little Red Riding Hood to the Fisherman and his Wife, Jack and the Beanstalk, etc. And the way we've laid it out kind of reflects the various sorts of backgrounds and authors, if authors can be tracked down, of some of these iconic tales. So we've got some Grimm's fairy tales, we've got some Andersen, Hans Christian Andersen, Aesop, a few from biblical sources, etc. And some from more recent sources as well. And then the final part of the book is an invitation to our readers, who we hope are kind of like us in the second half of life, whenever that begins. There's no magic marker or particular year that says you're now officially in the second half of life, but we wanted to open things up to invite people like yourselves, to see, well, what stories have stuck with you over the years and why? Not necessarily the ones that we've picked out, but perhaps other ones as well. So that's basically, where the book came from and what it's sort of organized according to it. This is a quotation that you may have read in that first chapter. Kind of sort of captures what we feel, that aging is an adventure potentially on several fronts, but it's also an adventure inward, an adventure into our souls, if you will. And we're not trying to define that big word. A journey into the wisdom that we feel has accumulated and tends to accumulate quietly inside of us across the years, along with questions of all sorts, etc. And the hope is that this little book and what we've been doing in it will be an invitation for other people to play around with kind of the open-ended questions and recurring themes that sort of rumble through us, and the kind of slow questions that seed themselves in us, oftentimes from an early stage on. Andy, if you don't mind, I'll say a little bit about a narrative perspective. Again, this is a little bit of narrative gerontology. I know that the concept of narrative is of some interest to people throughout the Taos network. So as a gerontologist, but from a narrative perspective, I look at us as we are the story species. We're continually making meaning by telling and retelling stories about who we are, what's going on around us, where we've come from, where we're going. And we do so within the context of larger stories and other types of narrative sources that are out there, stories that we've been brought up with in our families, our cultures, the religions that we may have been part of, the history that we've been shaped by, etc., and also perhaps the stories, the fairy tales that have gone inside of our imaginations and for some reason decided to stay there. So aging, we think, is a process, not just a biological process. A lot of emphasis within gerontology on the biological or the biomedical aspects of aging, but it's a biographical and therefore a narrative process as well. But there is a kind of an overarching narrative of decline, as it's been called, that oftentimes can insinuate itself into our psyches, and we kind of buy into it, that aging is this downward trajectory of just getting old and not necessarily growing old. Also, again, from a narrative perspective, we think that later life presents us with some pretty important developmental tasks, not learning how to tie our shoes or go to the bathroom by ourselves, but narrative tasks like casting our eye back over the life that we have lived thus far and hopefully reflecting on who we've been, what we've done, crawling back inside some of our stories. Later life also, this is a gerontological finding, seems to deepen our capacities for something called post-formal thinking, where we're more open to ambiguity and paradox and symbol and metaphor. And in my sort of view of things, there is an important kind of homework to be done. One source has called it the philosophic homework. I like to call it the story work that there is to be done as we get older. It's not just a matter of playing golf and doing all the fun things that we'd like to be able to do, but there is an inward adventure or journey to be mounted as well. And I think that can help us to sort of offset the narrative of decline that's out there floating around, and maybe see our own aging as not just a kind of an unmitigated tragedy, but as potentially an adventure on many fronts. So there's, as I say, there's story work to be done. I would say it goes along with the life review process, and there's different avenues to do that. Some of us, as we get older, want to sort of tackle it straight on. I'm going to sit down and write my memoir. I was born at a very young age. I went to school here. I married this individual, had these children, got this career, and so on and so forth. And that can be an important task to do. But I think there's also another way of doing that story work, which is kind of, revisiting journals that we may have kept and reacquainting ourselves with the different selves that we've been over the years. Pawing through old photographs like I'm doing now that I've recently retired. Having soulful conversation with peers and younger people. reading and maybe even writing fiction or biography or poetry. And we're going to suggest reflecting on fairy tales. But I should just mention a bit of a warning here that as simple and as gentle as they might seem, reflecting on fairy tales could be hazardous to your health. By that I mean, as we found in our journey of revisiting the Tortoise and the Hare and Little Red Riding Hood and Sleeping Beauty and Jack and the Beanstalk and Ugly Duckling, it can stir up things and issues that maybe you hadn't thought about too much or had sort of forgotten or buried or whatever, that can be initially kind of uncomfortable to look at, but ultimately, and this is in our weekly Skype conversations, which we've had steadily since we began working on the book, Andy and Barbara and I have found that crawling inside of these stories as 60 plus 70-year-olds has been a real adventure and stirred up things that we could not have predicted it would stir up in a good way, ultimately, and helping us to kind of keep our stories, if you will, open as opposed to foreclosed. One of the colleagues we have in the narrative gerontology world has talked about the danger in later life of what has been called narrative foreclosure, feeling that even though your life itself continues on, your story has all but ended. So this is where, the very first story that we tackled was the iconic Aesop fable, The Tortoise and the Hare, which we realized very quickly there are multiple versions of out there. And so when we took a crack at reflecting on this story, each of us, we were working with slightly different versions or translations where certain aspects of the story were brought out and others not so much. Personally, I realized quite quickly that I've always identified with the tortoise for not thinking that I was a particularly speedy sort of person in lots of different ways. Never very good when it came to the 500-meter dash in school. And I haven't stuck my neck out a lot, you might say. Sometimes as an introvert, retreating inside my shell. So I found myself being able to start to play with the aspects of the tortoise that really helped me to kind of reacquaint myself with aspects of myself that I'd sort of forgotten about. I also realized that in the Tortoise and the Hare story that I had some unresolved issues around my relationship with my father. And got me thinking about an old iconic story that I have in my personal repertoire of being in an iron lung, which I'm not going to tell you now because that would take up too much time. But I've always had this story in my head ever since when I was 2 years of age, I was put in an iron lung because I had polio. Turns out the story isn't technically true, but I've wondered why. It's like a part of personal fairy tale that I've kept inside my mind. I also realized, though, that as I thought about this story, that I also kind of identify with the hare or the rabbit. I kind of felt sorry for the rabbit. I mean, the rabbit was just doing what rabbits do and happened to fall asleep and ended up losing the race. That made me think about other cartoon characters that I had been sympathetic towards over the years, Wile E. Coyote and Sylvester the cat. So this kind of led me down various rabbit holes, if you'll pardon the bad pun, as I found myself probing deeper into the story of my life. Andy, do you want to say a little bit about your experience with the Tortoise and the Hare?
Yes. Barbara and I had the pleasure of looking at these PowerPoints before this session, and we certainly agree with what Bill has presented very eloquently so far. But I think it's also fair to say that we've interjected two slightly different voices to complement what Bill's emphasis on narrative was. Barbara was a psychoanalyst, and fortunately, when I married her, she promised not to practice therapy on me, and she also refuses to participate in any Episcopal services with me. But she listens well. Well, she listens well, but she asks questions. And so for Barbara, I think the narrative gerontology becomes one question after another. And so while I worried that she would write into rabbit holes, what I found was that she was much more interested in the tortoise and hare on the people who were spectators, not the tortoise or the hare. For me, I was a starchy academic, and I certainly mentored a lot of people and talked, but I kept my personal life as much as I could out of the some professional interactions. And so what I find in my 70s is that I'm much more willing to come out and say what I'm thinking, because those connections are an important part of this narrative gerontology. And so more than Barbara, who is even more of an introvert than Bill, I tend to go to cocktail parties and don't want to talk about myself. I want to hear what other people are saying. And so this open-ended approach is really quite liberating for me. I decided I was neither the tortoise nor the hare. I thought that I was the judge, but I wasn't going to be the rabbit who was judgmental.
I think from what Andy's saying, you can get a feeling for how we just cut ourselves loose and played with what these stories said to us, not in an essay style where we have 4 points and a conclusion, but kind of rambling, which may make it frustrating reading for some, but it was certainly liberating writing to do. And what we found, if I could just quickly, we found that these little stories, and I think each of us might have his or her own collection of, whether they're fairy tales, fables, parables, whatever. And also, I think that nowadays, younger generations may not find that these classic, iconic stories speak to them, or maybe they've never even heard of them or read them, but that may be a generational thing. But we found that in our experience that these stories, like for me, I did a reflection on Jack and the Beanstalk, which really helped me to kind of rethink some of my relationships with my family members, my dad in particular. And I found that in the writing about the giant, I could see, well, a big giant in my life early on was my father. But as I wrote about my thoughts on the Jack and the Beanstalk story, I came to a nice place in my mind about my relationship with my dad. I kind of worked through some stuff. It's kind of like a personal therapeutic sort of process. So stories like this can be like mirrors that reflect back to us aspects of ourselves or of our own personal stories. They can be like sieves that help us to filter out some of the gems of insight from our own memories, blank screens for projecting our hopes onto them, Rorschach blots for probing the workings of our inner world or our psyche, or parables, to use that word, for challenging assumed stories that we've had about ourselves. And for me, many of these stories had what I would call kind of a parabolic sort of function in helping me to kind of look at my own life story a little differently. And it's kind of like the two stories, the Tortoise and the Hare, or the Ugly Duckling, or the Jack and the Beanstalk, or Sleeping Beauty, or whatever. That story shed light on our own personal stories, but our own personal stories help us to get more out of or see different possibilities in those original stories themselves. So I think this might be a good place, Alex, if you agree, to kind of turn things over to this group from so many wonderful parts.
Could I just add one thing before you do that, Alex?
Please.
I was a teacher, a historian, actually, and I wrote far too much. I wouldn't make a very good environmentalist for all the trees that should have been saved instead of turned into pulp fiction. But mentoring was one of the stories I didn't include. And I was really always fascinated by the Odyssey. And that one moment when Mentor, with a capital M, talks to young Telemachus and says, well, your dad's coming home. And Telemachus says, well, I think I'm going to jump in. And the mentor says, maybe not here because there's sharks down below. Why don't you go over a little bit further to the left? And so Telemachus goes to the left. And then the mentor says, I'm going to join you. I'll dive in with you. And that seems to me what mentoring is in terms of positive aging. What you do is you talk to your peers, you talk to rising generations, you show some skin, you get wet, you admit your flaws, and then you move on.
You see the kind of conversations the three of us, can you imagine, that we've been enjoying ever since we started working on this book and since? So I don't know what a good path would be to follow for the rest of the time we have, Alex, but one possibility would be to invite people to, comment on what we've been saying so far, but also maybe some of you have particular stories, fairy tales, fables. I saw the comment in the chat room by one of you, I think you're based in Freiburg, stories that kind of stay with you. But our final chapter of the book is kind of turning things over to the reader, saying, okay, you've seen how we played around with these stories that we've looked at. What are the stories that have claimed your imagination over the years and why? And what do those stories say to you? What can you get out of them in a playful kind of way? This is a form of life review that's not sort of heavy-handed. It's kind of playing on the edges of things and seeing what emerges. So I guess the floor is open.
Yes, and maybe you can stop sharing the screen. I will put the questions in the chat. That way people can still refer to them, but
Sure.
maybe we can see each other as a group.
Yep.
Madeline has her hand up. Go ahead.
I do indeed. I want to congratulate you on the work that you've done. I have worked with story for over 20 years. And in fact, in my book called Unlocked, which is about resilience, I say that one of the things you need to do is explore your own stories in your life to understand who you are, because stories form us. Whether we hear them, whether we live them, they're forming us. And so I loved the track that you went on. For me, the fairy tale that comes up to my mind is the little match girl, who in the end freezes to death, but is greeted in heaven by her grandmother. Now that, I can almost never talk about that fairy tale without clutching up. I used to read it to my daughter and would cry every time I read it to her. And even today, it's affecting me. What I realized was that when I was younger, that I had progenitors, I had grandmothers, I had mothers, I had aunts who could succor me. Today, in my 80s, I realize I'm the grandmother now, and I have to be ready to do what I need to do to reach out. So thank you.
Wow. And you've also, pointed out that, Madeline, that the stories, even though they are seemingly were written for and geared to children, are full of all kinds of real tough adult stuff.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And those themes and archetypes kind of crawl inside your psyche at an early age when you're not even realizing that it's happening. Yeah. Wendy Danto, Ellis, Fox. Can you unmute yourself, Wendy?
Yeah. We're all multiple personalities, right?
There you go.
So I too appreciate this work, and I really think about it in a broader context. Having been a voracious reader my entire life, I have found not necessarily solace at times, but stimulus from evolving my own story in the books that I read. And from an early time, if anybody knows what the word chutzpah means, which is Yiddish for, okay, I've had chutzpah. When I was a fairly young reader. I came from a family of readers too, so that probably had a lot to do with it. But there was a book written by Elia Kazan called The Arrangement. And in it, the protagonist is defined as crazy by everybody around him. But he wasn't crazy to me. And so I actually wrote to Elia Kazan as a 7th grader or something and said, I'm really confused about this because I don't understand. He seems to be perfectly sane to me, and I'm not getting however I worded it. And I actually got a letter back from Elia Kazan saying that he appreciated it and my letter, and that there was no one right answer to what I was asking, but that he imagined as I got older, I would be able to evolve a different understanding of it. I still have the letters tucked away someplace, but that whole interaction between a reader and a book, I think you've elevated that to our attention, and it's still something that fascinates me. And so this even dialoguing with authors of a book is another piece of that. So thank you.
What book has influenced you lately that you would like to have an author talk to you?
Oh, what a lovely question. Wow. I just finished a book that really didn't provoke that in me, so that's a good question.
What was the book?
What's the name? Can't remember the name of it right now. But I do think a book that really highly influenced me is called The Lilac Girls. And I can't name the author right now, but it's basically, she does a beautiful job. There's three contemporaneous stories during World War II of 3 women's journeys around World War II. One who actually became a doctor for the Nazis, another one who raised money and did charitable works in New York City for people impacted in Europe by the Holocaust, and a 3rd woman character. And she tells their stories contemporaneously in this book. So you switch from one person to another. Phenomenal way, because they're all sympathetic characters and they are diametrically different.
My wife, Barbara Lewis, liked that book too, and she has handed it to me when I finally decide I have killed too many trees to read.
Yeah, that's a problem I have. I like to hold an actual book and smell it and touch it, and yeah, I'm probably not the best environment.
I see we have a Nikki Spies or Spies. You're raising your hand there.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. And I haven't yet read your book, but I am definitely looking forward to it. I would just like to share that as a child, I loved fairy tales. But as a grown-up, I was quite appalled to see how violent many of these stories were, and looking from a gender perspective, not at all the kind of stories that I would like to perpetuate in women's lives. And I'm still sitting with so much confusion about it, and often not knowing how to position myself to it. So one side thinking maybe that's a way to prepare us for the real world out there. It's very confused at times with fairy tales as an adult.
Yeah, they're far from simple stories, regardless of how simplistic they might seem on the surface. Yeah, like any story worth its salt,
Yeah.
But as a way of preparing us, got another I see another hand going up there. John Reisman. Okay. John Reisman, one of the creators of the Taos Tilburg program, always said to me that reading a book is like being in conversation with the author. And he's right. Yeah, ideally, that's what we, I think, like to experience when we have that book in our hands. If we do have books in our hands, is to feel that relationship with whoever's behind the page, sort of coming up with all this stuff that we're reading. Cheryl Svensson. Hi, Cheryl.
Hi, nice to see you, Bill.
Hi.
I know both you and Andy know Jim Barron, but
Yes.
he started a program called Guided Autobiography more than 40 years ago. And so for the past probably 25 years at least, I've worked on that program of its life story writing and sharing in groups. So I'm wondering, I don't have your book yet, but I'm wondering if in the book there's things, because I still work with older adults, so I still work in groups.
Yeah.
If there are ways to implement how you've done it, or if all of you have just each done your own story and we are trying to figure out how you did that.
The last couple of chapters, part 3, Cheryl, particularly the last chapter, which Barbara wrote primarily, it offers some guidelines and suggestions for going forward, either as individuals or in a group setting. But thanks for mentioning the guided autobiography method, because it's a powerful method. I've seen it at work, and I've read a great deal about the positive effects. So you could think of the fairy tale discussion that people might have around what stories stick out for them as another theme, almost.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. Mike, thank you. Mike Bugler?
It's called Maike, and I'm the one from Germany. And when I got this invitation to today's event, I was thinking of the Brother Grimm fairy tale, which is similar to the Tortoise and the Hare. It's called The Hedgehog and the Hare.
Okay.
And I was just reminded of, I could see so many situations in my life, and I'm currently exploring the kind of rite of passage into my next life phase. And what does this fairy tale tell me about the life, and also how can I shift things so not to identify with one of them, the hare, but go to a less effort and strong character of this tale. And I was wondering whether I could learn from you in terms of how you worked with these tales then when you detected them in your life.
Well, for me, Micah, it was, and by the way, I've been to Freiburg different times. I have a good friend there named Stefan Marx. Stefan Marx and his partner Heidi. So if you run into them, say hello for sure from me. But for me, it was a kind of a serious but playful process, as I just sort of I didn't have a plan, which may be a weakness in the writing at times. I didn't have a plan when I was thinking about what does Jack and the Beanstalk or the Emperor's New Clothes say to me now, but I just kind of allowed my imagination to kind of come to the fore and lead me where it wanted to. And I did feel that in some respects, reflecting on some of these stories did point me personally towards the next stage or the next phase, or it certainly helped me to kind of wrap my mind and heart around some internal issues or questions that I never really sort of looked at head on. And these stories in a playful way allowed me to do that and to start to work through some things and move forward in hopeful ways. I'm not sure what Andy's experience would be on that.
Yeah, Ms. Bugler, I think your comment parallels Ms. Swenson's comment. I actually knew Jim Barron fairly well and studied his biography. For those of you who don't know him, he was really one of the giants in building gerontology. And when he started his career, he worked with Nathan Schock at the National Institutes of Health. And he was really a very strong scientific empiricist. And it seems to me that when he moved to his theories of aging in the 70s, the first article he put in that book was by Gary Kenyon, one of Bill Randall's colleagues. And there was a shift. It was a shift that he shared with his wife, Betty Beeren, who was much more willing to talk about theology than Jim was. But in many ways, I think Jim Beeren, for me, amplifies what you can do in the fourth quarter of life with positive aging, because I think he really did maintain a scientific thing. I remember one time in La Jolla, he had us all watch the sunset and he measured it, which is what he did as a younger. But when he talked, he was very, very empathetic. And there was a side of him that comes out in his positive aging in his 70s, 80s, well into his 90s that was important. Karen?
I somehow can't find the
Hey, Karen.
computer icon, I feel, of the little hand. So thank you, Andy. First, kudos to the three of you for this wonderful book. I had the privilege of reading it ahead, and as a psychologist that does a fair amount of leading writing groups with folks at various phases across the life cycle, since I read it, I tasked myself with what's turned out to be fun job of using this book as a springboard for one of my writing groups. So I am in the midst of using this, and I'll tell you how I did it. But first, I just want to say, Nikki, I really resonated with your comments, because as a kid, I read a few fairy tales, but I honestly, if you'd asked me as a young adult which ones I read and what they meant, I wouldn't have had much recall. And then I happened to have Bruno Bettelheim as one of my teachers when he was at the orthogenic school. And there was so much controversy surrounding him, and he was such a challenging teacher that I mostly left with a very bad taste in my mouth, the whole idea of fairy tales. So when this book was in the works, I thought, a great opportunity to maybe see if I can rework my whole relationship with the fairy tale. So anyway, of course, I'm getting as much out of this group as the members are. And what I did was, we've been meeting on and off for about a year. And it is a group of 65 and plus, and it's sort of self-selected over time. And I've done it more in the standard way, working with prompts. But I dangled this idea in front of them, and they all thought, reading a fairy tale again. Oh, well, sounds kind of strange, but, yeah, let's try it. So I had them pick one, and they all picked Little Red Riding Hood. And basically, as you, Bill and Andy have been talking about, they have been writing, and the task was they're going to do 3 separate writes about the fairy tale. So the first one is their kind of free association, which character, just who is it that they felt most identified with, what's their kind of free floating impression. And then the second, and we just finished the second, was what they remember they viewed about how they viewed that fairy tale as a younger person, and how they view it now, and the contrast. And the third one is going to be around the theme of what is it that the tale offers them in the way of a template or a vision board for creative aging.
Wow.
I'm dying to hear that one.
Jeez. Yeah. Keep us tuned.
Oh, it's really been fun, and been just very meaningful for me to revisit all of these tales.
I don't know how much time we have left, Alex.
About 10 minutes.
Oh,
I think
one of the-
Roslyn, raised her hand. I think.
Oh,
okay.
I think.
Somebody raised their hand?
Yeah, I thought Miss Stroll did.
So I just want to come, this is amazingly rich. I absolutely love it. Early in, started writing poems at, I think, 3rd grade, but that's always my integrative process. But I love the idea, and I love that Bettelheim got mentioned, because I eventually loved him for insisting that the dog had to be in the story. And a lot of that controversy was we all wanted, or I guess the world, we wanted the sweet stuff.
Yeah.
That we weren't willing to face, all the things we're facing in life now, the violence and all the rest of it. Anyway, what I found when you said what fairy tale was that the fairy tale gives me the bones. And it's my job to bring memory, imagination, my senses, my meta life, my metaphorical life. And at the time where I felt like I had gone through some personal trauma, felt I had lost my metaphorical life, and it was the worst death. It was really a dark, dark place. And I couldn't write. I wasn't writing. And but the story of Silver Hands came into my repertoire, and I realized what happens is if I engage with the fairy tale and then I move into my own process, that I can't even recall all the details of the original story, because they invite you to transmute what's going on. And that all I can remember as I'm listening here, I'll have to look it up, was that in my poem somehow she gets to have a silver heart to go with her silver hands. And I can't remember if that's a dark thing or if it's, but I know it transmuted, I didn't have to go back to the story. So I absolutely adore this process that you're not only explaining, but you're telling us your experiences with it, because it's invited me to come back into the experience of being in story and the taking, the Native American storytellers I've listened to you say, you don't write for children because everybody takes from the story what they are developmentally able to take from. But I've never heard my generation, at 75, my generation talk about what they take from fairy tales. So really kudos and thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah.
I want to add that a comment to Rosalind's point. I think we think of fairy tales too lightly. Not that the authors have, but I think we have as a culture, because many of the fairy tales have been watered down as they're being put into the press. We don't want to disturb our children. If you look at some of the original fairy tales, they're very dark.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Barbara is not here, but I think it's fair to say that she shocked me with Little Red Riding Hood and Hansel and Gretel by talking about sex a lot. And I don't think I could spell sex much to understand what the heck it was all about. But it was very interesting for her to sort of dig in to the story as a septuagenarian and say, come on, folks, let's be honest and let's be open.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I had a thought there, but it went away.
Oh.
Karen?
Not that I know of.
But you don't have a thought? Oh, sorry. Okay. One of the stories that I played around with was not exactly a fairy tale, and it's one I didn't actually technically read till I was in my early 20s, and it was C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I read, in my 20s, and I reread the first book, and the scene that I kept being haunted by. This is how, there are certain details in these stories that we glom onto, and others that we sort of are fuzzy about, but once we glom onto something, we take off with that. But it was this image of little Lucy, if those of you who would recall that story or read it. Little Lucy, who stays behind while the rest of her siblings are touring this house where they're staying during the Blitz. She finds this big wardrobe, and she's just compelled to open the door and start walking into it. Keeps walking, and lands in the land of Narnia. But that I took that as a metaphor for me of my journey when I read a book. We've talked a lot about the books that have been major influences in our lives, and every time I open a book, a new book, or an old book that I've had for years but never really properly read, it's like entering another world, wonderland of sorts, where there's new thoughts, new ideas, or ones that kind of help me make sense of other thoughts and ideas I've had. So I'm not sure why I mentioned that, but this idea that there's adventure just there, even though we're 70, 80, and we've got the arthritis, and we've got the doctor's report, and we've got the concerns, and we've got problems with this, that, and, there's still that child's heart, rumbling around, dancing around, asking why, how come, and that's what this exercise for me, and maybe for Barbara and Andy, has helped us to reconnect with, that the child within who's always there. I think we've run out of time, have we not, Alex?
You have 5
We have
minutes.
about 5 minutes, and actually,
geez. Okay, I don't have a clock in front of me.
If I can jump in, I wonder how or if it changed the way you talk to children in your life, with children, grandchildren, or younger children in your life about fairy tales or about stories. Has writing this book changed the way you talk to them?
Good question. Andy, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, I have 2 daughters and 2 grandchildren. And, being a grandparent's wonderful, because you really don't have to take the flack that the parents have to take. And in a wonderful way, your daughters are now in their 40s. And so they're going to go, let's cut the bull, Dad. What do you really think about such and such? And I don't deflect things as well as Robert Butler did, but I find myself turning to fairy tales as a way to try to find some middle ground where they can talk to me because they're familiar with these fairy tales. The grandkids, I'm not sure what they're texting. And so there's in some ways a technological barrier. But I became more open talking to the grandkids without transgressing what their parents were telling them.
I'll get back to you on that personally, Alex, because I don't have any kids or grandkids in my life at the present time. I do have students I still work with, and I'm always amazed at how students in their 19s and 20s and so forth, we have fantastic conversations. So I like to think that this fairy tale exercise has maybe reconnected me with my own inner youth, kid, teenager, college student age, whatever. Because there's a timeless quality about these stories. I do wonder sometimes about the present generations of kids coming along who maybe would not get exposed to it. Maybe that's a good thing, not be exposed to Hansel and Gretel or Little Red Riding Hood or The Emperor's New Clothes. But then maybe they have other comparable sorts of stories that are filling that fairy tale need that they may have.
The Hungry Caterpillar is
The
one.
Hungry Caterpillar?
Mhm.
Okay.
Stroll?
Oh, no, I just lost his name. I really encourage you, if you haven't already, to try out the mutual storytelling technique with children, which you can do with children of any age. And a couple of things that have worked for me is having someone older than 10. So, you know, some of those young adults, and inviting their 10-year-old to interview them. And getting that 8 to 10-year-old perspective. And then the other thing is, I'm less worried about the original storytelling because they are archetypal. And I've also discovered with, you know, great nieces, because I also don't have little ones around. But with my great niece, if I stay long enough and play with her and invite her to invite me into her magical world, it's astounding.
Yeah.
And they have the same themes going, whether or not they call it Red Riding Hood or what it, you know, or Mousy the Duck. It doesn't really matter. It's the fact that they so readily go into their magical world. And then if you're willing to even be there, kind of like Barbara said, as observer, I liked her comment about sometimes it's enough to be the observer. And that the other thing to be aware of is, whose life am I in the story? Whose life do I enter through? It's a kind of window. And what gaze do I take? So do I take the observer gaze? Do I take the participant actor gaze? You know, that can shift around also, but it's really rich. And I love particularly listening to these grandparent age men talk about entering the magical world of our inner child, you know, which can sometimes we're led into by being willing to be the observer or the actor in the child's magical world.
Yeah, the mutual storytelling is wonderful. The other thing my grandkids particularly love is the I'll do a story, start a story prompt, and they finish it. And that's
Richard Gardner. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes,
I want
yes.
to say the author is Richard Gardner. It came to me while you were talking there.
Yeah, of mutual story, right?
Richard Gardner.
Wonderful and fun.
Well, Alex, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Yeah.
It's been a great hour.
Thank you very much.
Thank
We
you.
so appreciate
Thank
you
you.
coming today, and thank you everyone for joining us. So again, the recording will be available. We will
Thank you.
send that within a week or so in the email address that we have from your registration. And yes, very, very nice seeing you all. So thank you, Bill, and thank you, Andy, for such a wonderful time together.
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Thanks,
Thank
Alex.
you.
Yeah.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Be whimsical.